Hello again and welcome back. We can reconvene with the second panel for today. I would like to ask Professor Pierre Béranger to introduce the second panel. Pierre is, of course, a professor, associate professor here at the Landscape Architecture Department and co-director of OPSIS and also advisor to the US Army Corps of Engineers. So, Pierre, if you would like to introduce the second panel and the panelists.
Thanks very much, Nikos, Danny, for the invitation to moderate the afternoon session on territorial transformations. Now that we've been able to introduce the notion of scale as part of the metabolic rift that was described this morning in terms of requalification of the way in which we understand patterns of urbanization, we'd like you to suspend your thinking about urbanization itself and imagine the following scenario. Imagine the planet as a big brownfield. In fact, imagine the ocean as a big recycling bin. Consider it less a virgin resource to protect or a sensitive system to shield, but rather as a big ball of oscillating waste that keeps moving and circulating, where everything from the air to the atmospheres to the water in the oceans has been used, abused, and reused. Materials and fluids in different concentrations, whose varying distributions are in constant motion, powered by existing Earth processes, arrested, attenuated, accelerated by methods of extraction and evolving technological processes, adjusted, layered, and thickened by economic change. On this planetary surface, waste is the impetus for improved production, enhanced consumption, intelligent exchange. Brown, in other words, is the new green. If, and I quote, the shift from one mode of production to another, end quote, according to spatial theorist Henri Lefebvre, must entail the production of a new space, then the transition from industrial systems, closed, linear, that produce commodities and waste, towards urban economies, open, circular systems that cultivate commodities from wastes, should also produce new spaces and open new geographies. Thus, the territorial transformations, the metabolic shift that we will be speaking about this afternoon with our guest speakers. If waste is natural and necessary, how then do we design our future? Looking beyond the residual reclamation of industrial waste as a catalyst for development, the profiling of emerging wastes, residuals, materials allow us to trace contemporary contours and new urban geographies, new urban territories beyond cities themselves. In other words, we outline a landscape of flows and fluids that they engender and that they influence. Through the characterization of these new territories as a field of flows where materials are like fluids with different concentrations, chemistries, volumes, viscosities, and vectors, urbanization entails the design of speeds, cycles, and viscosities. Urbanization, synergies as well as synchronicities of these interconnections. So as a revisitation and a requalification of the notion of metabolism in urban discourse, this new or contemporary metabolic representation that the guest speakers will be presenting today may also advance the contemporary ecologic subject, whose premise lays in the perpetual circulation of materials, providing a path, an endless loop of material resources through interactive spaces of exchange, responsive processes of production, regulatory flexibilities, and fluid geographies of cultivation. So with this, our four presenters this afternoon, over the next hour, we will start with Lola Shepard. She's founding partner of Lateral Office and associate professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada. She received her Bachelor of Architecture from McGill University and a Master of Architecture from Harvard Graduate School of Design here. She's co-director of Infranet Lab and co-editor of the Bracket publication. The most recent one, Goes Soft, and the current At Extremes. Lateral Office is an experimental design practice that operates at the intersection of architecture, landscape, and urbanism. The studio is committed to design as a research vehicle to pose and respond to complex urban questions in the built environment. They engage in the wider context and climate of projects, social, ecological, and political. Lateral Office is also committed to architecture programs and typologies that directly respond to the demands of the 21st century. Recent work and research focuses on powerful design relationships between the public realm, infrastructure, and the environment, particularly in the Canadian North. Second presentation will be by Salvador Rueda. He is an urban ecologist, founder and director of the Urban Ecology Agency of Barcelona that was founded in 2000. He's specialized in analysis and planning of complex systems. He's developed models of occupation and urban metabolism with sustainability criteria. He's also designed a new urbanism, which he qualifies as the ecological urbanism and a new urban cell, and that's qualified with the super apple, in order to plan the public space and urban mobility. He's also created a new language to read the city and a measuring instrument to calculate the urban complexity of those environments. He also apparently loves the city, but he adores walking on mountains. And his best projects are his 4 children. This is taking metabolism to a whole different degree. We don't even need to say more about that. And finally, our third presentation is be a co-presentation with Jane Hutton and Keel Mo from the graduate school here. Jane is a landscape architect and assistant professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture here. She is faculty director of the Loeb Library Materials Collection and co-director of the Energy, Environments, and Design Research Lab. Her work focuses on the extended relationships of material practice in landscape architecture, looking at links between the landscapes of production and consumption of common construction materials. Jane is also the founding editor of the journal Scapegoat, which deals with aspects of architecture, landscape, and political economy. And she's also co-editor of the issues, the first one on service, the second one on materialism, and the sixth one on Mexico. Keel Mo is assistant professor of technology here in the Department of Architecture. He is co-director of the MDes program. He's also coordinator of the Energy and Environments unit within the program itself, and co-director with Jane of the Energy, Environments, and Design Research Lab. He's author of Insulating Urbanism, Insulating Modernism, although that could work too, right, within the conference. Convergence, an architectural agenda for energy, building systems, design, technology, and society, and finally, thermal active surfaces in architecture, as well as integrated design in contemporary architecture. So with that, we will get started with the first presentation of the territorial transformations, and we will begin with Lola Shepard.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be part of this broad discussion. So I'm going to, my talk is titled Territorial Metabolisms, Far-Flung Urbanisms, and I'm going to start with projects that are more urban and gradually move to the progressively less urban but more territorial. But I first want to maybe look a little bit more at the sort of idea of urban metabolism and metabolic processes. Let me see if I, oh, wrong button. That way? Okay, perfect, thank you. The study of urban metabolisms, particularly sort of from the design side, has largely been tied to an understanding of the city or of urbanism as a kind of ecosystem with inputs and outputs which can be accounted for. And a key subtext of many of these discussions is the development of tools and a kind of accounting to achieve increased sustainability. in looking up, being a kind of designer, I probably gravitate towards the visual. I started looking at sort of images and diagrams that describe various ideas of metabolism. And I came across two drawings, one from the Urban Metabolism of Brussels, which actually I think was referenced in Matthew's lecture earlier, that looked at the urban metabolism of Brussels in the 1970s, and then came across this, which was a diagram for lactate metabolism in the brain. And I actually found it potentially kind of problematic how similar these two drawings actually looked. And I think this is, in a way, part of the sort of subtext of some of the sort of discussions sort of motivating this conference. I think that there's been a kind of tendency to overprivilege the kind of analogies to the biological, the ecological, and the scientific processes. And these have been highly attractive to architects and urbanists for a long time. But I would argue that maybe these analogies only go so far. I think on the one hand, it produces perhaps a kind of over-embracing of technological expression, and on the other hand, perhaps a kind of over-belief in the accounting of metabolic processes. This is actually taken from a very recent publication called Sustainable Urban Metabolism from Ferrao and Fernandez, published, I believe, last year at MIT Press, which in many ways is a kind of very thorough and in-depth idea of looking at urban metabolism. And they write that the ambition of the book is a better understanding of urban materials and flows and their interaction with nature, and to draw analogies with metabolic processes in organisms. But I would argue that in some ways this is perhaps handcuffing how we think about the idea of the metabolic processes more broadly as sort of design agents. And so I'd like to put forward maybe three ideas for expanding design thinking about metabolic processes, and show three projects located, as I say, in sort of very different environments. One, the first one being rather urban and progressively moving towards a kind of territorial scale, which hopefully address maybe some of these ideas. So the first idea I'd like to put forward is the idea that metabolic processes offer an opportunity for an extrinsic urbanism, one in which environments might be wired to support new economies, new ecologies, and new public realms. This idea of wiring is less in the kind of marine urbanum sense of technological determinism of the environmental bubble, but rather to ask whether urbanism can embrace more complex systems in which economic and environmental infrastructures are leveraged or coupled to format new public realms. If Banham argues for technology as an instrument of environment, philosopher and biologist Jacob von Uexküll in the 1930s was looking at the idea of environments of species, and as a way to kind of understand, in bringing it back to urbanism, perhaps the kind of performative role of environment. And he argued that an animal is not immersed in a given milieu, but at best engages with certain features of it that are of significance to it. And so he differentiates what he calls surroundings, which are everything, and environment, which is actually much more instrumental. And he goes through a range of species and produces these sort of amazing drawings. So on the left, you have the analysis of surrounding and environment for a scallop. And so on the top is what he would describe surrounding, which is everything. And on the bottom is what is useful to the scallop, which is the rock. And similarly, in looking at surrounding an environment for the bee, there's the idea that the surrounding is everything. It's the flowers, the grass, the hills in the background, but that in terms of what is instrumental in the environment, it is only the surface of the flowers that can be pollinated. And I think that if we translate these ideas back to urbanism, it suggests that metabolic processes might also need to calibrate to the needs of environments and occupants. And the sort of corollary to that is that it challenges architecture and infrastructure to be calibrated to the scales and complexities of environment and urbanism as well. So the first project that I'd like to show is a somewhat older project called From Runways to Greenways. And it looks at a question of urbanism in Iceland. Iceland, as I'm sure you all know, is a sort of, in some ways, unique and isolated nation, but also in the North Atlantic, but is also interesting in that it is highly urbanized. 70% of the population, in fact, lives in the capital of Reykjavik. It's also, of course, a country with vast geothermal potential, and politicians and are perpetually sort of trying to figure out how to leverage this vast, sustainable resource into multiple economies. So the competition asked for the reconceiving of an area around a defunct airstrip, which you see here, just south of the city. It's a vast site. The competition essentially asked for a kind of doubling of this historic city. And I should say that this was a competition that began pre-crash. So there was a kind of optimism in growth. There was an optimism in the role of universities and biotech as things that would sort of catalyze this new urbanism. And so the premise of the project was really that landscape and exterior program could act as a catalyst for urban development, and saw exterior space as equally charged with activity, use, and event as the interior spaces and buildings that might come subsequently. And so the project began by establishing a kind of no-build or public landscapes that largely followed the existing airfields and essentially converted each runway into a new greenway, and used various qualities that existed in the city to define these. So the three greenways were programmed as follows. There was an ecology and civic runway, there was a production runway, and there was a recreation runway. So the civic and ecological one ran north-south in green. The production runway is a sort of slightly bluish one running northwest to southeast, and the pink was the recreation runway. And really the idea was that in concentrating most of the public infrastructure of energy, farming, industry, and technology into these greenways, it sought to make the sort of infrastructure this more salient and more participatory for the public realm. And so in many ways, it was also an idea of literally, and I'll get to this a bit more in a moment, of wiring these greenways to sustain a number of activities. So as I mentioned, because of the sort of vast geothermal resources, in many ways, Iceland is a country that is already, in many ways, wired. It's wired at a kind of territorial scale with these amazing networks of geothermal pipes that bring energy from various parts of the country. There's already a strong legacy of greenhouses that tap into the geothermal. They wire their sidewalks to melt the snow, which I only wish we had in Toronto. And then there's public spaces in the forms of pools and so forth that are also all sustained and leveraging the geothermal resources. And so we were interested in sort of playing on this and pushing it further, and essentially sort of started to conceive of the urbanism, and particularly the production runway, as a system of intakes and yields of infrastructures, energies, and ecologies. So the production greenway is in a way the kind of driving force perhaps of the project, and was really a large landscape of production. And it began in the only sort of forested zone of the city, and essentially ran through a kind of barcode of changing activities and programs that are all interdependent. So there were greenhouses, there were allotment gardens, there was markets, there was tree farming and fish farming and so forth. Running below the production runway, and actually maybe I'll skip to this one, was a large-scale computer server farm, which leveraged the kind of vast geothermal, and many of the large companies like Google and Yahoo are already looking to Iceland as a kind of potential place to build their server farms. I think Facebook may have just actually committed to it. And so the idea was that the server farms could tap into the geothermal heating that the server farms needed no light but produced a vast amount of heat, and that heat could then be taken by the greenhouses that sat above, so that they were essentially mutually interdependent, and that occasionally the geothermal would concentrate in various places on the above ground to either demarcate public spaces, to warm the greenhouses as well, or the fish farms and so forth. The second greenway was the recreation, and it really created a kind of recreation corridor that defined the 4 new neighborhoods of the city, and each was conceived of as a kind of room with its own sets of programs, schools, playgrounds, soccer fields, and were treated topographically to start to buffer against wind and noise and so forth. And then the last greenway was the civic and ecological one, which began as a wetland tying into an existing wetland that is in the city already, where Aalto's Nordic House is, and then transitioning to a range of landscapes, a botanic garden, a park, and then terminating at the water and tapping into an existing warm water spring that already existed as a kind of recreation point. And each sort of recreation or ecological zone was tied into certain civic programs, museums, botanical garden buildings, and so forth. So the kind of intention of coupling these sort of systems was less sustainability as a kind of end goal in itself, but rather an opportunity to produce a range of urban conditions and experiences that support local economies and ecologies and enhance a kind of urban condition and set of experiences. And this is a view of where these various greenways intersect at the kind of center. But it was also about potentially then reconnecting Reykjavik into a larger set of networks, other ports, where some of the goods produced in Reykjavik could then be exported or traded with other surrounding cities. So the next idea that I'd like to talk about is this question that to operate at a territorial scale, infrastructures will need to change. They will need to be serial and networked in order to be adaptive, contingent, parametric, and responsive. And this seems to me, in a way, embedded in a kind of ambition for a truly metabolic urbanism, or even metabolic infrastructures, in fact. And I think that this idea of parametric systems, in a way, is less at a kind of formal level, of course, in this case, but really the idea that systems can respond in real time to external contingencies and changing conditions. And so, in many ways, there are 2 figures that I think did some interesting experiments with this. Buckminster Fuller and Cedric Price, who both had sort of long-standing interests in thinking about large-scale systems and open systems that could adapt to changing economic systems or user desires. Actually, sorry, let me go back. So Fuller early on, of course, understood the importance of understanding networks at a global scale, and he had developed what he called the World Games System in 1961, which was a kind of educational simulation which looked at networks of global resources. And he saw it as a kind of real-time game. It relied on comprehensive databases about minerals, manufactured goods, human needs, that would allow players of the world game better access to data than even, let's say, government people might have at the time. And it relied on a kind of constant monitoring of data and collecting of data. And the idea was that it required groups of players to work cooperatively to solve a set of metaphorical scenarios. And I think that this idea of, I think the project in a way brings up 2 questions. One is the idea of the architect as collecting information and processing that information and using it instrumentally, which is something that we're very interested in. And secondly, this idea of sort of constantly changing the kind of, that in a way one understands something as sort of responsive and dynamic. Similarly, Cedric Price who's of course famous for projects like the Funhouse Palace, developed a project called The Generator, which was an early investigation into artificially intelligent architecture. And it was commissioned, so this specific project was commissioned by Howard Gilman for Gilman's Paper Corporation in Florida to house a dance facility, a theater, and visiting artists. And so much like the Funhouse Palace, and in some ways also picking up some of the ideas of Pottery's Think Belt, it was seen, he actually described it, which I think is quite interesting, as an architecture that is less like medicine that would serve as a remedy, but rather as a kind of preventative system that would create flexible conditions that were previously thought impossible within a kind of socially beneficial environment. And so there was basically a set of cubes and components, gangways, and various spaces that could be reconfigured in different ways to allow for various formal and informal programs to take place. And the idea was that if the users were not transforming the space, that at certain moments the computer program would kick in to actually kind of transform the space based on previous patterns. And so again, this idea of a system that is, on the one hand, has a kind of kit of parts that are varied and that reconfigure to account for varying programmatic demands and user demands, I think is quite interesting in terms of rethinking, perhaps, ideas of infrastructure. So the next project that I want to show that sort of picks up on some of these ideas is a project called Water Economies, Ecologies, Farming the Salton Sea. I'm just going to see how I'm doing for time. And it really looks at, in many ways, also a kind of wiring of the American landscape. But it also, in a way, proposes a kind of counter-model to many current models of infrastructure, which are singular, which are often kind of defensive strategies relative to local ecological conditions and environmental conditions. And so it argues for a responsive and adaptive system of infrastructure. So it began really with a kind of interest in water infrastructure as it intersects with cities and agricultural systems. And actually, I'm going to go back for one moment. And it began also with an observation that the fastest growing cities in the US are also, for the most part, in the most water-strapped regions. And so there's this growing effort, has been happening for the last 100 years, to build ever more complex water infrastructures to sustain cities and agricultural production in regions that one might argue should not be there in the first place. And in many ways, nowhere is this more evident than in the American Southwest, where every, and particularly the Colorado River Basin, where every mile of the Colorado River has, over the last 100 years or so, been transformed, dammed, canalized, aqueducts, pumping stations, and so forth. And so it's really emerged into arguably not a natural system, but a kind of entirely constructed system in which hydrology, agriculture, and urbanism are completely intertwined, to the point that I would argue there is no, one can no longer separate them as separate independent systems. So, in many ways, one of the most striking aspects of water infrastructure sustaining the Southwest is the accelerated rate at which landscapes and ecologies are created, erased, and redefined. And an extreme example of this is indeed the Salton Sea. It was created in 1905 when the Colorado River breached its canal during construction, and it flooded the Imperial Valley, which you see as the kind of speckled zone just south of the black water body, which is the Salton, essentially refilling an ancient seabed. The resulting body of water was the Salton, which is, important to note, is endoheric, or a terminal lake, which, like Salt Lake and many others, in fact has no natural outflow. And the significance of this is that its water level is continuously increasing in salinity. So there's no kind of natural movement of water happening. And so right from the start, it was identified as what's called an agricultural sump. It was basically going to receive all the agricultural runoff from the Imperial Valley. And in that sense was sort of deemed a kind of aqueous water dump. Here's a kind of zoom in of the Salton Sea. So it's fed by these two rivers, which are the Alamo River and the New River, and it's basically fed entirely by agricultural runoff from the Imperial Valley, which is now, I think, the 9th or 10th largest agricultural region in the US. And there's also a kind of moment where you start to see the kind of politics of infrastructure. You see at the bottom the All-American Canal, which was basically America diverting the Colorado River, which would normally end in Mexico, and basically rerouting it back into America in a kind of game of brinksmanship. So the Colorado River in its early days was in fact a highly desirable place. It was a place of recreation. The kind of film stars of Beverly Hills would go there. In the 50s, it was stocked by the Department of Recreation with game and fish. It was a place for boating and regattas. So it was sort of vibrant in some ways ecologically, albeit artificially, and as a kind of tourism and economic region. And then essentially the toxins from the Imperial Valley started to concentrate more and more and produced a kind of massive fish die-off, which produced botulism in the birds, and basically produced a kind of environmental disaster. And so as you can imagine, that was the end also of the tourism industry. And it's largely become a kind of slightly apocalyptic sort of landscape. And so in a way, this picture is really just speaking to the kind of constituent elements of the region, this kind of heroic infrastructure, a kind of decrepit ecology and economy, and then the kind of still reliance on traditional, highly water-intensive agriculture. And so the sort of consensus from everyone was, well, nothing can be done to salvage the Salton. The only thing that can be done is sort of consolidate the damage. So there were projects to either pipe water from the Pacific for 400 or 500 miles, to dam part of it and allow part of it to dry up, and other parts of it to sort of remain on life support. But all the solutions essentially, as you can see from the price tags, cost a lot to produce very little beneficial effect, and took the kind of conditions of hypersalinity as a kind of inevitable failure. And so in some ways we were interested in saying, could one actually look at the salinity as less a liability but an opportunity to produce ecologies and economies that actually might thrive in these conditions, and start to kind of shift the sort of image of the Salton as purely a kind of aqueous dump where the Imperial Valley is the only driver, and rather to kind of shift some of the sort of resources from the Imperial Valley into a kind of more vibrant and complex Salton Sea ecosystem in a sense. And I say ecosystem in a kind of economic, cultural, and ecological sense. So the project basically began as imagining a set of infrastructural pools that had various roles. So there were production pools that would be able to support tilapia, which do well in very saline waters, harvesting of salt, and the production of small amounts of fresh water, the production of wetland habitats, and the sort of reestablishment of recreation that would again take advantage of the various salinities. And basically the idea was that, again, rather than a kind of singular system, one could start to aggregate these pools in multiple ways, depending on the kind of fluctuating needs, that they would be tethered within the Salton and then could be tugged essentially almost by a tugboat back to shore to be harvested and maintained. In a way, the master plan speaks to an idea that the Salton would once again, in a way, reconnect to its hinterland, although in some ways it is already itself a kind of hinterland maybe, but, and that there would be a kind of re-emphasis on existing centers. So there was a zone of economic development, there was a zone of tourism, and there was a zone of ecological remediation, which in a way leveraged dormant conditions that had previously existed. And so this was a kind of early view of this sea populated by these floating pools. And And then the idea that on the land, there would be also a kind of recalibration of the sort of production, so that there would be a shift from less water-intensive agriculture to saltwater greenhouses, to water processing, to salt drying, and so forth. And this was a view of one of these sort of industrial edges. And actually what I probably skipped over, but was that essentially the project had three components. There was the land-based transformations, there was a kind of new shoreline, which you see a fragment of in the brown, and then the infrastructural pools that could migrate. And then this was the zone, the kind of ecological zone, where the idea was that a series of wetlands would treat a lot of the toxic water flowing from the river that was basically picking off the agricultural runoff, so that a lot of the kind of cleanup could happen before the toxins were released into the Salton. And then the third zone, which was the recreation zone, where you might take advantage of different salinities for different programmatic activities. And we were, I mean, we perpetually tried to sort of tap into existing technologies that exist and simply scale them up. So we were looking at floating wetland systems. We were looking at existing systems of aquaculture, existing systems of tugging large volumes of water that the Norwegians are exploring. So this was a detail looking at how the kind of passive solar desalination of the water and salt harvesting could happen. And so really the project was about arguing, on the one hand, from a kind of economic point of view, could the Salton shift from a kind of fairly singular set of economies to a more complex set of economies, but more importantly, that these would produce a kind of new public realm. So I'm going to rush through the last project. So the third point that I wanted to talk about a bit was the idea that the site of metabolic processes extend far beyond the source of activities. And again, I think this is a subtext of the conference. And so it begs a kind of question of how we understand site and territory in relation to design. I would argue that, you know, as architecture seeks to align itself with infrastructure and landscape and urbanism and ecology, it can no longer define its parameters and responsiveness at the scale of site, but rather needs to operate at the scale of the broader territory. A space which is thickened and expanded with environmental data, competing social and political claims, economic forces, systems of mobility, ecological systems, and urban metabolisms. And I think that the kind of legacy of the GIS is both very productive, but also suggests that these systems can be delaminated in ways that are you know, in fact, not so easily delaminatable. But I think it also, what's interesting about the kind of different systems is that they each have their own sets of boundaries that overlap and intersect. And so the question of how one understands site, I think, becomes increasingly complex as one looks at more complex systems. So this is a map, for instance, of Walmarts in North America. And so, of course, the question is, in the context of something like Walmart and globalization, is the site of the Walmart just the actual site of the building, or is it the logistical centers and distribution networks and highways that support it? Similarly, looking at ecology, you know, when one is looking at something like toxicity, how does one, relative to a given site, how does one define the limits of the region that one is looking at? And similarly, if one is looking at things like caribou migration, this is looking in the Alaskan north, you know, the kind of sites by which species move is entirely different from the sites in which humans move. And so the idea that different stakeholders have different sites of operation, I think, is important. So I'm going to very quickly talk about, more broadly about the North, just to give a bit of context for the last project, which is called the Arctic Food Network. So the myth of the Canadian North that many of you have probably seen in National Geographic magazines is a kind of untouched virgin landscape that is, you know, in the news for issues of climate change and resource extraction. And in many ways, it's entirely removed from urbanization. This is a map of all the cities north of 60 in Canada. The two largest are about 20,000. The next one goes down to 7, and then quickly you drop off to several hundred. So the idea of urbanization in the north is very different than in the rest of the world. It's a huge region. It occupies close to 4 million square kilometers with one of the lowest population densities in the world. It's also, for the most part, a very young population and a fast-growing one. And in many ways also kind of culturally fascinating because it's merging indigenous populations with contemporary, exposure to global practices. So you have kids speaking Inuktitut, but then on Facebook and listening to hip-hop. So there's a kind of modern emerging North, which culturally is quite fascinating. This is the reality on the ground. This is the capital Iqaluit this is the capital Nunavut, of Nunavut called Iqaluit, which is about 7,000 people and which has doubled in size in the last few years. And this is a view of the second city called Rankin Inlet. And what got us fascinated about the North is that in many ways, because communities are largely distributed, there's often no infrastructure connecting them. The way in which, in fact, infrastructures work, the way in which services work, is entirely different. And this is where the kind of argument that, in fact, in some contexts, it's no longer about a kind of urban metabolism, but really about a kind of territorial metabolism in which many communities need to network, in contexts like this becomes very clear. These are just some figure grounds of some of the kind of communities, so it gives you a sense of just how small they are. As I mentioned, many communities, particularly in Nunavut, there are no roads, so the only way to connect things is by plane or in the summer by boat. And this is a kind of view of these snowmobiles, which speak to this kind of emerging culture, sort of hybrid. And what's also sort of fascinated us with the North is the question of how even do you define North? And this goes back to the question of how does one define territory? So there's, the North is defined by the line of 60, as defined by political, how you get tax base, defined by ethnographic lines, defined by the tree line, by permafrost, by the ecozone, by the road line, by geographers such as Amelin, who talked about many norths, the idea of the middle north, far north, and extreme north. And so this idea that, in fact, the North itself is a kind of series of composite boundaries that intersect challenges in the way the idea of a kind of single territory, even at a kind of already large scale that we're looking at. So I'm going to quickly talk about this last project, which is called the Arctic Food Network, which Ali, who's part of this conference, was significantly involved in, which looks at the intersection of culture, mobility, and ecology. And it began with an observation, again, because everything is imported, the cost of food is incredibly high. And so this is a kind of analysis of food baskets in various parts of the Canadian North. So you can see that in Nunavut, the price of food represents about half your budget. And that simultaneously, as kind of cultural changes happen, there's a loss of traditional hunting. So this is, I'm going to jump ahead. And so we began to ask, how might architecture intervene in a kind of question about the role of food culture in the Canadian North, and particularly in Nunavut. And so we were looking at the various food resources that exist in the North, the various practices of going hunting, building camps, going seal hunting, the kind of urbanism in a way that happens at these sites, the kind of ice fishing cabins that get built there that produce sort of temporary settlements. We looked at existing food infrastructure, so these are underground freezers that are built into the permafrost to store food. The emergence of markets that are food markets that are happening in the north, where so that people can share their excesses and trade their excesses when they hunt a caribou or a seal. This was an inventory of all the kind of different food infrastructure, so community freezers, greenhouses, Wi-Fi, which becomes kind of important in navigating, looking at the different mobility systems. I'm just going to go through some of this quickly. And looking at how, in a way, architecture might work at a kind of territorial scale without necessarily building larger. And we came across the work of an anthropologist called Claudio Porta, who had been mapping all the Inuit trails for hunting in Baffin Island, which is the most populated part of Nunavut, and simultaneously looking at what was available in the region. So there's actually, despite the kind of image of barrenness, there's actually a wide range of fish and meats and berries, and started to map where those were located, and in particular where they were located in relation to communities and these trails. And started to imagine a kind of network of exchange between communities, such that communities could either share or trade, and in that sense, in essence, kind of expand the access to food resources. So one community might have access to fish in one season, and another might have access to caribou, and through the trading, you could augment your kind of exchange system. So this was a map. This is Baffin Island and Fox Basin, which is the kind of water body, and this was a kind of conception of a network that would intersect the traditional trails, communities, and access to ecologies. And so the project was essentially conceived of as a kit of parts that could respond to kind of different community needs. So there were what we called stacks, vaults, meshes, and poles. Stacks were cabins and collective kitchens, and vaults were for storing food. Meshes were for harvesting aquaculture, and then the poles were for wayfinding. And basically the idea was that they could cluster in different ways in different communities, both in the communities and out in the land. And really, the idea was that these structures would extend, as I said, the kind of calendar. So this was us mapping all the kind of food sources that you saw earlier. The dark is what already exists, and the hatch is a kind of extension of that calendar. This is a view of one of the clusters of one of these cabins out in the land. And then in section where you start to see. And the project also looked at the idea of sort of hybridizing both cultural practices but also construction practices. So we were looking at traditional construction methods of tying sleds and looking at framing systems that could equally be assembled, because one of the challenges in the north is that there are no roads, so you have to bring everything either by boat or by sled out onto the land. And so we were looking at simple construction systems and also envelopes and structural systems that hybridize sort of traditional knowledge and contemporary. So on the one hand, there were CNC milled joints that would pair with sort of very simple framing members. And then in terms of the envelope, on the one hand was a kind of sort of high-tech skin, one might say, of metal with solar panels, which you see at the top. And then on the other two faces were, in fact, snow-packed walls that could provide insulation in the winter and could be open air and allow wind to go through in the summer months. So here were sort of the different kind of construction components. And a view of one of these collective structures from the inside. And so really, and this, well, just quickly, this is looking at it clustered in a community. So again, the idea that it could aggregate and respond to different community needs based on what they were harvesting or sharing or wanted at a kind of community level. So greenhouses, so forth, fishing cabins out in the land, and hunting cabins further out in the land. And this project began as a kind of reverse engineered project. So it began as a kind of self-generated project, and we have been reaching out to government agencies to see if we can actually prototype one. And so we developed a set of consultation tools so that communities actually give us feedback on what they might want. And the kind of kit of parts were imagined a bit like a sort of chess set, but also played off traditional Inuit games of spatial planning that they have using bones that can be used to kind of imagine organizations. And then similarly imagining developing a kind of structural framing model where we could get feedback on how that would be assembled. And this is a kind of initial consultation up in Senakilowak. The children were very amused by this. So really the project was again a kind of argument that, you know, infrastructure it sustains both ecologies, it sustains economies, and it sustains a public realm. So if the kind of current condition relies on a kind of southern import of food and quite frankly also of culture in many ways, the kind of proposed project looked at sort of increasing a kind of territorial network and a kind of local reliance in trade, and if anything, producing a kind of export that might be sent back to the south. And I'll end with a kind of observation that looking back on the kind of earlier projects as I was putting the talk together, I think the first two projects in many ways still privilege a kind of performative understanding of infrastructure and urbanism. And I think that the North in many ways, because of its fraught history and cultural complexities, in fact has kind of forced us, we've gladly engaged in the question of infrastructure's role at a kind of cultural level as well. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lola. Our next speaker, as Pierre was mentioning, is going to be Salvador Rueda. Salvador, as said, is an urban ecologist, founder and director of the Urban Ecology Agency of Barcelona since 2000. He's specialized in analysis and planning of complex systems and has developed models of occupation and urban metabolism with sustainability criteria. Please join me in welcoming Salvador.
Good morning. Thank you, Daniel, Nikos, and Pablo for the invitation. I try to give a lecture in English. It's my second time. The first was yesterday. Then I ask to you passion, comprehension, okay? Well, in terms of metabolism, the human beings have developed three regimes. The first one was developed by the societies of hunters and collectors. The second one was developed by the farmers in the Neolithic. Both was hang of the sun and the solar energy. The third regime is a regime of industrial era, is developed by fossil fuels. Mass consumption of fossil fuels suppose an impact with the big technology to transform the ecosystems, that the impact over the ecosystems is not tolerable. We know what is the consequence and the unsustainable this process. Then we need to rethinking a new regime. The new regime, I think, is necessary to link with, once again, the solar energy, renewable solar energy. But this, for me, is a necessary condition, but not sufficient. Sufficient, it means to reduce and control the entropy. And then the regime needs both renewable energy, but also control the entropy. For this, this is for me the guiding function, the urban guiding function for the sustainability. This is an equation of efficiency. In the above of the equation, we have the consume of resources, and below we have the organization, the urban organization. This is, for me, the guiding function of sustainability, because like a nature and the ecosystems in the nature, we need to maximize the entropy in terms of information. It means that in the time, in the narrow arrow of time, we need reduce the consume of resource and at the same time make an increasing of organization. The evolution is a very good example. We are, the human beings, the most complex system that we know. Our brain is the most complex system. The energy that we need to make in function this complex system is equivalent to 150 watts, only a light bulb. But our artifacts don't run in the same way, are not efficient. And then we need, once again, return of the laws of the nature in efficiency. In this case, it means that in this case is the actual tendency of the develop of our urban systems. The rate of increase of energy or natural resources is the same in this case, is increase related to the rate of the increasing of organization. And this is unsustainable. The way to make sustainable the processes necessarily is to reduce the consume of the resources and at the same time make a big increase of the organization. What means HN? It means the legal entities into the city. Businesses, facilities, institutions, ONGs. All that is organized into the urban cities, okay? This equation, given function, means also, or can explain the two models into the city. In the first time, if this is the model followed, the sustainable city is possible. At the same time, when increase the organization, the knowledge model is also working together. Both we are need in the process. This is one of the last models that I create, and the metabolism is related above all for this part of the model. The most important aspect that I think is developed in the city, we must develop it in the city, is the number of legal entities. If it is possible, the knowledge activities, with big density of knowledge into each legal entity. In this case, it means the natural resources go out to the support ecosystems and go to the city. And you can see the arrows are very narrow because we want to support the organizations, but with controlled fluxes of the natural resources. For this, it's possible to obtain these goals with several models that follow the same idea. I can show some of them. But the important aspect to get is increase the number of the legal entities and at the same time reduce the energy and the natural resources. In this case, it means, for example, in the case of the energy model or sustainable energy model, we want to increase the self-sufficiency into the city. It means multiply the number of the solar panels, produce a big number of solar panels, but also multiply the number of entities, legal entities or activities, business, to develop the entertainment of these solar panels. At the end, we have a number of deployments and the activities. In this case, the arrow increase a lot after you decide what is the, in this case, the energy model related with the sustainability. In the same time, we can thinking other models, and we have in all the cases a number of legal entities that in this moment we don't have. This is one of the models, in this case, of the occupation of the land, urban model. At left, we have the sprawl model, and I don't know if the sprawl model, and we can see the arrows of this part of the model. The arrows are very wide because we need a lot of resources after they pass for the industry and is converted in cars, houses, etc., infrastructures. And the most important is like we dispose, arrangement, the buildings, the infrastructures, and the model of occupation of the territory. In this case, is a functionalist model. It means the industry, the dwellings, the big, ¿cómo se llaman las grandes superficies? Sí. The malls, etc., are separated, and we need, after that, a network very big to connect once again. It supposed a mobility model that it increase in the measure of the model increase also. And in the case, for example, Los Angeles, more than 80% of the trips are made by car. It supposes also consumption of energy and emissions equivalent of the number of trips. In the same way, we can explain the consumption of the typologies of the dwellings. The majority is unifamiliar typologies. It means consumption of the energy and the emissions more than double of an apartment in a multifamiliar building. At the end, the impact of contamination is very big, and the consumption of resources also. In the case of the compact city, is not the same. It means we need natural resources lower, and the impact also is lower. And then is a model that follow the guiding function that I explained before. Related to the metabolism and the waste management, In this case, we have the city also and the planet. It means the ecosystem that it's supporting our organizations. In the same way, we have here arrows very, very wide, because in this case, the natural resources arrive to the industry for make the goods that arrive in the city and is consumed. After that, people use these objects and make this like a waste or like a resource. If they select in different fractions these fluxes, then it's possible to recycling part of these goods. This is the model that I use, and I thought, when I redact the waste plan management of the Barcelona's metropolitan area. In that case, in the 1997, only the 4% of the waste is reused, recycling. The majority of the fluxes go to the landfills and the incinerators. And also, these facilities had a bad efficiency, and the majority of the organic materia is emitted after the anaerobic processes, is emitted in form of methane. That, do you know, 21 times more greenhouse than the CO2. Is the new model. In this moment, 37% of the waste is recycled in this moment in the metropolitan areas. The arrow, in this case, is the arrow is more arrow than this, because we inject a number of fluxes of paper, can, plastics, and the others, that we can reduce the number of natural resources that we need to make the same goods. And the impact, in this case, is reduced also because we capped the methane, and also we transformed we have transformed the incinerator, and the gases in this moment is very, very low. This is the same, but in this case for the water. Only I won't say the fluxes are reduced after we change the model to manage the water. Not only the water, the supply water, also the marginal waters, reusing the rainwater and the gray water. And also, why not, in part, reuse also the sewage, okay? And eventually, we have here the energy model, and in this case, we can see the different aspects in the city, mobility submodels, mobility typologies of dwellings, housings, kind of industries, and also the services. It depends of this, then the quantity of energy that we need will be more intensive, okay? And in the other part of the model, we can see the quantity of energy that we produce, alternative energy we produce is very, very low. The future model, in my opinion, will be this. It means that the fluxes of energy, fossil fuels, uranium, etc., will decrease, and on the other hand, the alternative energies will increase a lot, and for this we need transform the submodels to make the consumption into the city. It means we need rethinking the mobility model. We need rethinking what is the typologies of buildings we need, and rethinking also the services and so on. At the end, para ir hacia detrás, ¿es este? At the end, all the metabolic models go in the same direction, is to reduce the energy, to reduce the consumption of water and materials. And in the other hand, in this case is not the subject, but we need to multiply the number of legal entities supported by fluxes of natural resources lower. Thank you.
Thank you, Salvador. So let's move quickly forward to the last speakers for the second panel. It's Jane Hatton and Kil Moe. They are both assistant professors here at the GSD. Jane at the Landscape Architecture Department, Kil at the Architecture Department. Also, they co-direct the Energy, Environments and Design Research Lab. Please join me in welcoming Jane and Kil.
Thanks to the organizers for putting together this absolutely wonderful event. I'm so grateful that it's happening, and I'm also happy to be part of it. So we're starting today by looking at this concept of metabolism from the kind of most discrete object, which is the discrete designed building or landscape. This is the scale that designers tend to work at. It's the scale also when we try to figure out how buildings and landscapes are performing. This is also the boundary that we often use, which is notably limited. Oops. Okay. But we know that buildings and landscapes could be seen as kind of temporal solidifications of materials and energy and social relations. And so what's really important is that we're able to understand them kind of beyond this boundary, as has been said in many, many ways today. And also to understand if every time that we specify materials and engage in relations of construction, lots of connections, both social, physical, ecological, are occurring, then if what we've built through landscapes and buildings is basically the corpus of our fields, then we might as well look at their anatomy and try to understand, use them as a record for understanding how these relationships work. So that's kind of our approach here for this project called Plot, where we're analyzing these two parcels of land, very emblematic and loaded in many, many ways, a building and a landscape also, in order to look at their material and energetic exchanges over time. They're both highly documented, discussed beyond, to death, but also have been recorded meticulously. So that's how we end up getting some of our data. We're looking at them in both of these parcels. So Central Park is more of a study of a kind of accumulation of energy and material inputs over time through different phases, and the Empire State Building is actually the parcel of the entire block. So that includes 4 different types of construction that were subsequently constructed and demolished, and we're interested in positioning them obviously in time, but also in terms of economic periods, which are also related to material consumption as a whole, and both locally and globally. We're interested in how they play out in terms of are contextualized and kind of reformulated through these times, and how material flow and labor are also implicated in this. So essentially we are using archival documents to redraw and model these different sites. We are using anecdotal ads and kind of source information to identify sources for as many of these materials as we possibly can, and we're weighing them and tracing them. And so, and basically taking that mass and that distance in order to find a calculation for cumulative energy. And so there's 2 things going on here. There's an interest in some form of accounting, an imperfect accounting, but also an interest in following these lines and what they tell us anecdotal. They're very anecdotal. They're incredibly variable, and they pass through very interesting and important stories about labor relations and also biophysical conditions. So starting with Central Park, I'm just looking at a few examples of kind of moments in these material exchange cycles. So this is a quote from Smithson, who describes the park not as a park, but as a manifold of relations, not as isolated objects, which is very telling and apt for the day. And so first I'm going to talk about fertilizers as they're related to the region in general. So the park was framed as a pastoral antidote to the urban experience. It was pitched as a proxy for the agricultural countryside, which was quickly growing further away. It served this function symbolically and programmatically, but also metabolically. So as populations were exploding, new waste streams were emerging from overflowing privies to new industrial effluents. They were at once valuable for their fertility and burdensome for just how much there was. And so for a while, these materials were somewhere in between like a really good new commodity and a problem that hadn't really been figured out yet. So the plot of land, which was eventually selected to be the site of Central Park in the first half of the 19th century, was suburban to downtown, and many people had relocated there for kind of a cheaper land and more the possibility to have small farms. The most established of these settlements was Seneca Village, which was the first major settlement of African American landholders and the center of northern antebellum activity. By the time residents were evicted for park construction, Olmsted and Box noted that Seneca Village's offal shops, market gardens and bone boiling operations had deposited high quality organic matter that could be used to enrich the park soil. So it was part of the kind of site condition, but it was also a necessary specification for growing the stuff that people wanted to grow. So in addition to these found human-generated fertilizers, composted horse manure and night soil were the primary organic amendments used to enrich the soil in Central Park's newly formed slopes. So horse manure was already a municipal waste problem by the early 19th century. In New York City, manure piles in the park were controversial as powerful Fifth Avenue property owners lobbied to have them moved up north, and the same horses that dropped the offending matter enabled the displays of wealth and physical class separation that the carriages provided. Night soil, the contents of Manhattan's privies, was collected by independent scavengers. The city regulated and encouraged the collection and sale of night soil to agricultural regions as a privatized municipal waste service. This is a quote from George Waring, who is also the engineer of the park in Central Park, who was arguing for the use in general in the region of night soil to feed the city's growing urban population. And as the urban wastes were increasingly exported to farms and as higher potency fertilizers became available, like guano, sedimented seabird excrement, agricultural practices shifted from small scale to commercial production. So of the material inputs of Central Park, South Pacific guano traveled the farthest. Charging Peru with monopolizing the profitable guano trade, the United States Congress passed the Guano Islands Act of 1856, which granted U.S. citizens the right to occupy any islands that had guano, any unoccupied islands that had guano. So Baker's Island was one of these. It was a 1 mile atoll covered in 4 feet of solid guano. And rapid depletion of this material led eventually, as we heard before, to the development of the synthetic production of ammonia, and that was which is now the basis for the current global food economy. So it's interesting that the metabolic underpinnings of the city as a whole are kind of played out in this like specification of what's going into the soil in the park at this time. So the second topic is about the bedrock extraction in Central Park. The first, at the top is a diagram from the first annual report of the park, which draws the existing geological conditions, but also describes how those geological conditions can be immediately turned into commodities for constructing the bridges and the tunnels and the retaining walls of the park. And essentially, the parent material of the bedrock was turned into 97% of the overall constructions came actually from on site. So there was just an incredibly local production of building materials. So the rock was kind of interesting and part of the design agenda because of its rockness, but then it also could be cut up and be used for its structural capacities in the case of the perimeter retaining walls, some of the bridges, and you basically see this kind of cycling of this material in different places around the park over time. This is a regional map of other materials that were being used in the park at that moment. The majority of these materials came from New England, except there was some brick from Michigan, some brownstone from New Brunswick, and the farthest flung materials were coming from, were very small. They're tile from England and bronze sculptures from Europe. So the last fragment of a cycle I want to talk about is about biomass, basically the vegetation, the tree canopy in the park, and how it has changed over time in relation to investment and disinvestment, and how that relates to maintenance regimes, essentially. It's something that I'm just getting started on, but essentially the narrative of the park's history is always described in a very clear-cut, kind of glorified moments of construction, terrible decline of disinvestment, everything goes to pot. Then in the 30s, with WPA funding, Moses comes in, fills in the reservoir with and produces the Great Lawn, and that progressive funding essentially reinstigates a very, very rigorous program of maintenance, and the quality of the vegetation changes again, and then that's followed by another period of decline. And so essentially, so this is Hooverville, which was an informal settlement constructed in the early 1930s. This is in the reservoir before it was filled in. And on the right is something that was called the Manor, which was constructed by a series of unemployed bricklayers out of construction debris. So there was quite a kind of small temporal urbanization happening inside the reservoir. So Moses's tenure, WPA funding, lots of labor and capital invested in the park to do these larger scale infrastructural developments. Also kind of intensified maintenance and pruning and kind of tree care. This was followed by, and I'm especially aware now of naturalizing or like there were so many wonderful cautions given in this morning's panel about dangers of kind of generalizing historically, so I'm aware of that, but anyways, just go forward. I had my slides already submitted. So this is the period of decline, disinvestment in the park, less maintenance, crime, a whole series of narratives that are part of this, but obviously a result of kind of less maintenance, less pruning, has some impact on biomass, but also different forms of use. This is an example. This is a demonstration against the Vietnam War in 1969. So at the same time that there was a kind of scourge on the park in terms of it's being unkempt and wild, and which I think that I think that there may be an interesting argument to be made about how much that has to do with trimming the shrubbery and kind of the danger within a landscape, the dangers considered when you have wild vegetation. So just looking, and then in 1982, the Central Park Conservancy takes over and starts to invest a lot of private-public partnership funding into the park, and including a series of different of major kind of legislative and managerial changes, increasing maintenance, policing, and kind of just general management of the park. And so and that has seen a threefold increase in terms of park users. But essentially I want to try to look at this outside of the narrative and try to understand first what happens in terms of what's actually happening with vegetation growth in relation to that changing maintenance, and also how the progressive era and neoliberal managerial processes are affecting that.
Okay, so this project, this inquiry also affords a particular view of the urbanization dynamics and allows us to ask much more specific questions about the difficult whole of urbanization as an open thermodynamic system. So we can also look at the building. We can look at the plot of the Empire State Building, which again is cited because it's an excellent emblematic index of a whole set of processes that have happened over the last 2 centuries that are far less singular than this particular plot, but nonetheless are useful. And as Jane mentioned, again, this is one of the best documented deconstruction and reconstruction projects of a site in Manhattan, so that's one reason I selected it. It's also because in the era of scientific management, the general contractor said that building this building was the nearest equivalent of peacetime equivalent of war. So the kind of issue of logistics and documentation becomes really important, both in terms of labor, its sources, and materials and its sources. I also selected this building because of its name. Empire is a fantastic and apt term for a study of urban metabolisms and the thermodynamic, geographic, and political forces that bear on them. I also like state, which is both a description of a political apparatus and a description of a thermodynamic condition. Also apt for the project. And then you have building, which is both a good noun and a better verb, but is also a reminder that we are in fact building these metabolisms, that we are in fact designing them. So of course you also have empire building and state building, but nonetheless all of these terms are excellent descriptors of this project. And finally, I selected this project because of Rem Koolhaas's incredible insights on this from Delirious New York. As a sort of an armchair thermodynamicist / urbanist looking at this site over time, he described it as a form of architectural cannibalism, which is a very specific type of metabolism. But most importantly, he saw it as in terms of accumulation, which is an extremely important term for the day, as well as this, what he describes as a way that all these constructions preserve the memory of the occupants of this site, which, as it turns out, is actually a very good definition of what Howard T. Odom would describe as emergy in terms of all the energy required to make a product. This is certainly true of the case of the Empire State Building, and is thus the unit of measure for these sites. In other words, our mode of analysis here is based on what I would describe as the metabolic gift, given today's sequence of terms. Now, in rather straightforward terms, this research simply explicates all the material and energy accumulated on this parcel over the last couple centuries. As it evolved through a series of transformations whose familiarity actually masks some deeper thermodynamics that help us understand and project different metabolisms for the future. As such, the unnatural history of Manhattan begins with the Anglo occupation of this plot of land some 300 years ago. But rather than the sentimentalization of the island evident in the left side of this image, we are interested in the very impure mixtures and quasi-objects of the left and right sides of this image, and in particular the most distant parts of the horizon at the top of the image, and even more telling, what is clipped off of this image as a system boundary of consideration. So the unnatural history of this parcel thus begins with the intensely local ecology of the original farm that John Thompson began to cultivate in 1799, the first sustained, documented anthropogenic ecology on this site. The site of the future Empire State Building parcel, located between Thompson's water source and his farmstead, would have likely been occupied by productive agricultural and grazing fields. Thompson's modest farmhouse was located on what is now the middle of 35th Street, and the evolution of this house itself is an index of an increasingly powerful and productive farm. But of course, this modest building was matched by its modest material geography and with rudimentary sources and routes of trade. By the mid-19th century, the shifting ecological efficacy of the material energy plot of the Empire parcel included a series of load-bearing masonry row houses, the first constructions on the parcel itself. Even a crude approximation of the exergy-emergy ratio of these common row houses on 34th and 33rd serves as an interesting backdrop to the more ostentatious and powerful mansions built on Fifth Avenue by the Astoria brothers. While the row houses maintained a relatively local thermodynamic system, the Astoria mansions reflected a more broad geography and powerful system. The sheer scale of the buildings, constructed with more extensive and higher energy materials, clearly amplified the power of the buildings, a heightened accumulation and expenditure. For instance, press brick from Philadelphia, freestone from Nova Scotia, and other decorative stones and furnishings from Europe extended the reach of this building, or these buildings, and their intake. Yet the thermodynamic power of these mansions is reduced in our analysis as the greater energy serves nominally the same exergy of a similar sized household and quantity of people. The death of John Astor in 1890 triggered the next transformation of the plot, which was the construction of the Waldorf Astoria, a 13-story load-bearing masonry building finished in late 1890, adding such things as elevators, plumbing, et cetera, to this site, iron construction, for a set of 450 rooms, again, all pointing towards shifting energetic and exergetic functions. An equal jump emerged in energy occurred right after the completion of the Waldorf Astoria, when the other brother sold off his parcel and began to construct the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, now 1,000 rooms in aggregate, including increasing levels of energy in terms of steel construction and more increasingly large, lavish decoration for this building that, of course, reached well beyond the isolated plot of the land. I like how these barely legible route diagrams actually remind us of hurricane and tornado path diagrams that you'll see in the New York Times occasionally. I do think of buildings as a certain type of vortex, so this seems apt. The almost geological, perdurable accumulation of brick and stone masonry of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, however, would not last for long. In a fit of obsolescence characteristic of so much real estate development and creative destruction in the 20th century, after 35 years of use, the hotel was demolished to make way for the Empire State Building. The fate of this massive accumulation of hotel material can be traced down 34th Street to docks on the East River to a dump site off the coast of New Jersey, where the bulk of this hotel is now sitting on a sandy shoal off the coast of New Jersey. So then, thus, excavation began for the Empire State Building, digging down to bedrock. Most of that excavation material ended up in the Croton Reservoir filling, which now is the Great Lawn. And with material deliveries arriving every 7 minutes, the new high-rise tower was completed in just over a year, but of course had the farthest geographic reach and more material miles than any of the preceding construction. Now, as one way to peer into the thermodynamics of these flows, we have to ask some very basic questions about these constructions that nonetheless yield some insight about the energetics of this parcel and its thermodynamic evolution. For instance, the simple question of how much mass is in each of these constructions offers some insight. I was particularly astonished to find that the weight of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and the Empire State Building are nearly the same, within a few percent of each other. It made me wonder if there's some kind of scaling law that might exist for these maximum power systems and how they exist in an urban context. But the sheer mass of this material is one thing. Considering the energy of each begins to indicate which construction has greater capacity to feed back on its system in a nonlinear way and on its geography in a nonlinear way, and thus we can begin to see some sense of what the maximum power system might be for each of these plots. The Empire State Building requires quite a bit more energy for this construction, especially when you consider it as a form of cannibalism that thus aggregates all the previous levels of energy that were evident on the site. In this way, the hotel, or the Empire State Building has 2.5 times as much energy as the hotel in this more full accounting of the building. And all this bears itself out if you take a macroeconomic view of the parcel and its relations to the city. If isolated as a plot, the increasing energy would be seen as a problem in normal sort of Calvinistic accounting measures and notions of sustainability. But since this building since every building and every parcel and every form of urbanization is non-isolated, the parcel begins to behave in a much more interesting way when you consider it as a household. In short, this is a question of the kind of oikos of the site in relation to the world that constructs it. And so one thing I've been doing is not only documenting the material and the energy per year, but also now starting to think about the exergy of the people that occupy these buildings, occupy the household of each phase of this construction. And then through that, you can start to get some sense, much more relevant thermodynamic indicators, such as the exergy to energy ratios and energy to exergy ratios that tell you much more about the maximum power status of each of these phases of construction. And it's super interesting, I think, to note in the context of today that both the farm and the Empire State Building are radically more powerful than the load-bearing masonries that sat in between those two. But those two maximum power systems, the farm and the Empire State Building, have very different nonlinear implications for these non-equilibrium systems. Another way you can think about this is in this mode of analysis. If you were thinking about a contemporary double-glazed glass office building as you're taught to design a so-called sustainable building in a city with the Empire State Building, a similar number of occupants, et cetera. Obviously, the kind of neoliberal folly of contemporary technocratic design approaches becomes extremely evident. So by internalizing the various externalities of these sites, more astute thermodynamic indicators are possible to grasp for these urban systems. Thus, plot is not simply a more comprehensive accounting than managerial tasks such as life cycle analysis or LEED certification or any of the other technocratic cousins. Rather, it's part of a methodology for politicizing the thermodynamics of urbanization and the evolution of civilization. So as one conclusion, it's our view that there's considerable agency latent in these vast ecologies and geographies. And once you actually get into what Matthew called the kind of details of this historical unfolding, I think there's actually a lot more to be described, often some very surprising results when you actually consider metabolism rather than just think about it or conceptualize it. And with that, maybe we'll just jump, hopefully, to some conversation if we have any time left. Yeah.
So thanks very much. There's absolutely no implication of me being at the head of the table at the moment. What we'd like to do is take a few minutes to field some questions from the audience. It's worthwhile to not only recap, but perhaps draw a thread. There's a few threads that I thought would be particularly important as part of the presentations that you're bringing forward. Very clearly, through all of the presentations, the notion of the very general notion of externalities that are being repatriated through a metabolic lens is particularly important. And in order to be specific about this conversation, it's very clear that as part of all of the reviews of projects that you're offering, that there's also a critique of perhaps an engineering of urban systems. And I'm going to try to make reference very specifically to perhaps some antecedents that seem to be referred to in your projects, because I'd like to lead into a question in relationship to how you see not only this exterior landscape that's being reclaimed as part of this discourse being important, but also both how and why the scale of time seems to be completely absent as part of current discussions on whether or not it's on sustainability, on performance, or quantitative analysis. Each one of your presentations allows us to be able to also repatriate a timescale as part of an understanding of whether or not it's on urban spatial analytics or it's on the historic review of the projects. In yours, Jane and Keel, you use this, let's say this 200-year timeline, and you backdate the projects to be able to understand the origins of the construction of the project itself. And to a certain extent, you use the very beginning point of departure of the construction of the projects themselves to look at it in a cross-generational perspective, where in contrast with your presentation, Salvador, where the notion of the generational cycle, the transformation from today to tomorrow, implies this generational cycle from today into this future. It's also not a 200-year projection, but rather a generational one. And then finally, Lola, I'll use the project in Nunavut just as one example, where you bring in the seasonal cycle as part of the timescale to be able to reveal another level of performance as part of the project. And for me, what I particularly interesting is that for as much as there's discussion about the quantitative externalities associated with projects, all of yours, yes, do account perfectly or imperfectly as part of your work, but this aspect of timescale seems to be particularly important as part of this discussion. And I'm wondering if you could, before we collect a series of questions, could you speak a little bit more about how you made decisions on that? And it could be very, very simple in terms of like, well, here's the construction date, or when you were, let's say, reverse engineering the work or developing the projects and projecting them, when did that time scale all of a sudden become into clear focus as part of your work?
Well, my presentation is the result of our work in the Barcelona's Urban Ecology Agency. We are 50 people, different specialists, and our objectives are to resolve several problems related with the cities. And then we not only make research, but above all, we want to change the reality. And then our models are intentional models. all our models want to arrive to, at the end, determinate objectives. And then our research is applied. We want to arrive at these objectives. The time, in several cases, is longer to get some aspects of these objectives. In other cases, is more quickly. We, in this moment, are working in mobility, in metabolism, in urbanism, but above all, we integrate with a holistic vision all. And then the time for us is very important, very important.
Okay, thank you very much, Salvador. Lola? And perhaps I'll also, I'll try to contextualize as well. The nature of the question also comes from, for example, the work of Jesse Azubel in terms of his kind of, let's say, manifesto on the liberation of the environment, which, he's a firm advocate that we're far better off than we were, 600 years ago. And we're no longer fighting mosquitoes in different parts of the world. And although, albeit uneven in terms of this development and this liberation, I'd also like to qualify it in relationship to the work of Jay Forrester, who's, there's a constant discussion about systems thinking and in relationship between inputs and outputs and where materials come from and where they're going. But timescale itself was relatively absent from both his work and also from the work of his students in, for example, the Club of Rome. So the question is also trying to get at, let's say, the agency of different timescales in a very both specific way, but also programmatic way.
I mean, I guess I maybe have several answers to the question. I mean, I think on the one hand, if one is going to make ecological analogies, which I think only go so far, but certainly we know that organisms react and ecologies transform, thank you, differently in different seasons. So in projects, let's say like the SALT, and the idea that if you're or any kind of urbanism or infrastructural system, the need for it to kind of be able to adapt to changing conditions as ecologies thrive or not, or economies transform, or public realms transform. If you're going to embrace a kind of metabolic approach, the idea that it needs to be able to kind of read and respond to changing timeframes and the kind of what's happening in those changing timeframes seems important. I mean, I think the other aspect in the work in Nunavut is, we've had a long-standing interest in how architecture can respond to environment at multiple scales. And if you go back to the vernaculars in the north, of course, they're very opportunistic about building certain structures in certain seasons and other structures in other seasons. And so on the one hand, there's a kind of, can the building at a kind of building performance level actually be smarter? But I think also programmatically can it adapt? We know that we do certain things in certain seasons, whether it's in the north or quite frankly even sort of quote unquote down south. And so I think the idea that the building in many ways, from a kind of environmental way, from a programmatic way, responds to these changing timeframes, which might be seasonal or might be much longer timeframes, seems central to a kind of argument for a metabolic urbanism or metabolic infrastructural networks and so forth.
Pierre, I'm going to back into your question, but I will answer it. All of the epistemologies, all the methodologies that I inherited or were given to me to think about energy are only valid for closed systems, for linear systems, et cetera, for steady state systems. All of those systems cannot stand the word time. That's their biggest irritant. And so on one hand, it's very, just to be very upfront about it, only interested in non-isolated systems and thinking about buildings and urbanization as a non-isolated system. So time is a very important element and parameter in all of that. So it's whether I'm thinking about heat moving through a wall or heat moving through the planet, I have to have time in there. Otherwise, I think it's completely irrelevant to, we shouldn't waste our time with it.
I had two thoughts to the question of time. One is in setting out the methodology for this project, I realized that I was committed, because there was such a clear kind of, in the case of the Empire State Project, there was such a clear kind of stochastic rhythm of building and destroying. And so I was trying to force that. I was trying to force the park to have that, actually, and it failed. And so I think now what is actually a lot more interesting is trying to understand how I mean, as an open system, how the accumulations of materials from construction to like a yearly deposits of different things and accumulation of biomass is actually a lot more interesting. But I think what's really critical in the question of time, and is something that I would like to get much more into, especially in the context of this project, is to think historically about the kind of social and political conditions. So it's not time. It's not a kind of timeless time. Right. And if we're really trying to think about materials, they're produced somehow, and we need to understand the conditions that enabled those types of production. And so if we were going to have any way of thinking about right now. So for me, it's kind of an exercise in just getting a little bit familiar with why we make things now the way that we do.
No, I think it's a great set of responses, given the fact also that, I mean, there's, not to use the word metabolic metaphorically, because I think it goes against everything that we've talked about, but there is a metabolic history through the project where you index the project temporally to be able to reclaim, or at least claim, these social and political externalities. I mean, the relationship, there's two things that really strike me as part of the presentation, where there's a discussion about labor that goes into the project that very often, and the texture of that labor that is very often externalized as part of a quantitative approach, even a material approach, where we could understand how that could go south if it only was centered on that. And then also the imperfections of conducting the research, which I think is important given the fact that there's a lot of, let's say, positivism associated with sustainable accounting these days. And it seems to me that at least trying to be specific in terms of like the amount of time it's required for heat passing through a wall, or the production of certain harvests, or longer periods of time in terms of understanding like what generations were working on a project, how those in fact provide a way to let's say avoid these externalities as part of let's say even sustainable forms of accounting. Okay, with that, I'd like to take a few questions from the audience in regards to the presentations that we've had. So I can draw out my list of questions if you'd like. I can ask some. Mitchell.
Do I need a mic?
Here.
Sure. Thanks. I thought they were all fantastic presentations, and I'm very familiar with the work of pretty much all of you guys. Not so much you, but it's great to see it. And I thought that, and then what you showed today seemed to be very design agnostic. And I know that all of you have in your blood, design. It's there, but there's a kind of an idea of data, graph, mapping, this kind of projection of histories, and the kind of the affect and posture you've had in your presentations really wasn't necessarily about or design or privileging design. So where do you see design having any kind of agency in this work? Where does it become something in the foreground instead of subsumed under the kind of the needs and this thought or this theory of immanence when it comes to urban metabolic issues?
I mean, I don't know if I totally agree with the question that there's design agnosticism. I mean, I think, like in the case of the two earlier projects, as I said, they're probably a bit more, well, certainly Salton is really looking at a kind of idea about a system and how that, and so the kind of, and the creation of a kind of synthetic or cyborg landscape, as we were talking about in the earlier session, arise more from a kind of aggregation of units. And so I would agree there that the design is more in the kind of system and the sort of potentials that it enables rather than in a kind of aesthetic specificity per se. I do think that in something like AFN, the work is sort of very much trying to learn from everything from sort of tectonics and crafts to certain forms to the shape of the building being driven by wind performance or snow accumulation and so forth. And I sort of skimmed by some of that a little bit. But although it is, I think it is also perhaps because it's navigating different eras. Again, it's less the kind of role of form per se than what it engenders, socially, what it might produce in terms of building, local capacity in terms of skills, and so it has byproducts beyond, let's say, just the form. But I can tell you that in the North we get lots of questions about the form, so it's all relative. It's very much a sense of perception.
Jane, you want to jump in now? Sure. Mitchell, I would say, I mean, design is a great way to ask all kinds of questions and get all kinds of feedback from the universe. This is simply fundamentally a historical and documentary project that allows us to ask certain questions and therefore then project certain futures that we can design. But if I simply started designing this project, I would never sort of discover the thermodynamic, like a scaling law or something like that. And I need to know that because, again, the kind of extant methodologies and epistemologies, whether they're design-based or research-based or whatever, aren't giving us that right now. So it's just a way of asking a new question, I think.
What he said, yeah. Well, I'll just say, I think in addition to that, I think there are, for me, these, let's say the three anecdotes that I brought up about nutrient cycling, construction with extant materials, and what maintenance does in terms of form. Like in my mind, those are all actually really interesting strategies for design. So whether or not they're like absolutely expressive in a really particular formal way, I think that to me they're generative in that way. And because I have the microphone, I want to thank our last slide got cut off of our presentation, and I want to thank John and Manuel and many other people who helped us with the project. So our last slide did that, and then we didn't get to show it.
It's my fault.
Yeah, it's Keel's fault.
Yeah. Yeah. You externalized your labor.
Yeah.
We do.
On top of the question that Michelle has pointed out, I think that when I see the presentations, this fascination with mapping and so on, but also there is a fascination with matter itself, accumulation, exuberance, excess, and I think that there's also a kind of new approach to history in architecture. It's a kind of tale on how things are grown in time, etc., etc. So, if just to try another response to your question, I think that these two things are, in a way, new, or at least the way these two things are put together are new, and hopefully they are creating a kind of new expectation on how to design. Maybe.
Thanks, Iñaki.
So now I'm going to ask a question that usually gets asked of me and I don't have a good answer for. And I was interested especially in looking at the material life and the energy life of these iconic structures. But the question that came up for me was, what was the social utility of all that material, all that energy? If you just don't consider that, well, yeah, you have one story. But when you consider this little farm that produced for how many people, and then you consider this massive structure that I have no idea how much social utility it had, but it seems like that is one of the central points to these structures coming into being. So I was wondering how you would put that into the equation somehow.
Well, I mean, there are the kind of exergy to emergy ratio is a way of getting at that and asking which ones, if you want to use the word utility, which ones, have the most utility or have the most power ecologically, urbanistically, et cetera. So that's a way of asking that for sure. But by no means I would never, contain it. That's just one small little question that comes from a very small calculation. I think collectively the ambition of the project is to address these much more far-reaching, cultural and social and political questions that are very much a part of the formation and transformation of these parcels over time. Right? Is that, I don't know. We can talk more, Earl. Yeah.
Like the unanswered question. Maybe we can try. Jane?
Thanks very much. I just wanted to ask something about, in a way, after design or even non-design. Lola spoke about the Salton Sea, which was a kind of accidental landscape, and I just wondered if you could say something about how you conceptualize such an extraordinary space. It seems in some ways quite an exceptional space, but extremely fascinating. My other question was for Jane. You made a comment about vegetation in this rather sort of complicated dynamic relationship with maintenance, as we might understand it, or what happens after a designed landscape is there, and this really interesting set of changes that you spoke about. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about this relationship, if you like, between vegetation and maintenance in that particular landscape.
I'll answer your first question. I mean, as you were asking it, I was thinking about the aerial rendering that shows sort of, in theory, this total system, albeit in flux. And I think, that's the moment where representation can be dangerous, because it suggests that there's a kind of total view, even if there's an argument that it's ever changing. And in a way, maybe the much more honest view of that project would be, at the scale of one of these, pools or two of these pools, where you never actually get a kind of total bird's eye view, because not least one never experiences it that way. But I think in a way it would be more truthful maybe to the spirit of the project, which is that it is sort of incremental and changing, and that things may get added or removed or die off, and that it's never a kind of total system, that it's maybe more sort of concatenation of many microsystems. So I may have to go back and revisit my representation.
Yeah, in terms of maintenance and growth, I think there's a couple interesting things. One is that pruning creates more growth, and so there's absolutely not, there isn't even a kind of like, well, we cut it and therefore there's less of it. It's growing, and it stimulates growth in a different way, so you can't really be too linear about those relationships. But I think it's interesting in the history of Central Park, I think it's interesting that there are these two major periods that are perceived as, well, basically there was minimal investment, and they're absolutely perceived as socially problematic, and like basically every cartoon or in Harper's or in the New Yorker at the time involved a shrub, like somebody's like hiding behind a shrub. And so it just occurred to me that it's actually very interesting what maintenance does, both biophysically, the pruning biophysically, but also in terms of scaping the landscape of acceptable interaction. And obviously that's changing a lot right now. Specifically, that both of those moments of decline were kind of fixed by major investment. So in the first case, WPA money, and then private funding now. And so you see lots of interesting cases throughout the world now where lower investment is leading to ideas about lower maintenance lower maintenance landscapes, and there's a lot of discussion about the aesthetics of that, the potentials of that, and so I think that's pretty rich in terms of thinking about what money is there, how much cutting happens on a daily or weekly basis, and what comes out of that.
One last question for this panel.
Thanks, guys. So I suppose it's appropriate that you brought up the concept of repatriation as you pose these initial questions, because the question of territory is something that has sort of been skimmed over in various ways in the different presentations. And throughout the morning, there were a number of just sort of extraordinarily complex spatial relations that were sort of embroidered into the presentations in various ways, and each with their kind of attendant spatial models, whether it's a field or a network, a system, a plot. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the sort of anxiety of delimitation that's very much part of redefining how we claim territories of design now, and whether territory is in fact a really operative concept for that.
I have a really quick answer. Just because I was just thinking about this myself, in terms of there's been a lot of discussion, and there is in the school in general, about how these ideas change practice, right? What this means for a landscape architect working today. Does it mean we're designing territories? And I think those are really interesting questions. And I was thinking to myself that actually in my mind, these ideas don't necessarily have to change the delimited area of work. Like for me, they won't. I will probably work at the scale of that first logo, but that the consideration of them is really important. The consideration of them has the consideration of larger relationships means that you conduct your work differently. So I don't see myself kind of like working continentally, but rather that those relationships pass through very small places too. Yeah.
My response is just that whenever I'm introduced to something, whether it's a new project, another designer, or a news article or something like that, my first question these days is, what is your system boundary? And I either get extremely bored or extremely excited by what I see it when I look at that object in that sense. So, I mean, the rhetorical part of the plot is to delimit it to this site as a total conceit, just so that you force all these relations outside of that modernist object or that modernist conceit. So.
I mean, I think this question of how you I think the territory, one can't speak about it in the abstract. So I think the territory of any given site is actually changes depending on what you're looking at. So if you're looking at the project in terms of a network of social relations, the scale of that site may be one thing. If you're looking at it in terms of the species migration, it will be another. And if you're looking at it in terms of, the infrastructural networks of roads, it'll be something else. And I think that's, it goes back to this argument about sort of redefining site or architecture working no longer at the scale of site, but at territory, and that there are multiple boundaries depending on what you're looking at. So they don't, unlike the GIS diagram, which conveniently everything is, 1 square kilometer or whatever it may be, that in fact they all have completely different boundaries. And I think this maybe goes back to the earlier question about the role of mapping and data. I mean, I think part of the reason that all the projects actually embed a high level of research is that the research becomes a way of actually defining that territory, and which are based partly on what what emerges as important, and what opportunities are kind of possible. I mean, I think most projects are also looking for the opportunities for intervention, and so the kind of mapping becomes a way to track that and see where things overlap or where or intersect. So I think territory is not a kind of abstract thing. I think it's ironically very site-specific and specific to what you're looking at.
If I understand well the question, in our case, the projects is the boundaries of our projects. It depends of the territory, the place that we studied this territory. Normally, the first that we studied is the context. The context for us is the first step that we need resolve before we propose some transformation. If the context is not project some impact with our transformation not tolerable, then we renounce to the project. On the other hand, we search also not go beyond the boundaries of the capacity of charge of each territory. We need to know if it is water or energy or others that with our action after that, this ecosystem or this territory is not possible to renewable the variables of the beginning. And this is our kind that we approximate our works always.
One of the things, that I was thinking about is, I think that to say you're looking at the scale of the territory is very different than to say you're designing the territory. So I think that, one can be looking at a territorial scale and in fact only designing a tiny point or a network of points that, impact a kind of much larger landscape, whether it's socially or ecologically or whatever it might be. So I think there's, architects, there's a kind of legacy of the megastructure where, to have bigger impact, you build more. But I think that, should seriously be questioned. And so I think, I think the argument in my mind in terms of, again, going back to a kind of metabolic argument, is less designing more. In fact, it's really how little can you design, but how broad can your consideration of the factors going into that design be?
Another question about this. Normally, the planners went to resolve the principal problem that they have to resolve. But several times, the secondary variables don't have the attention, necessary attention, and the dysfunctions come after that. In our case, we break the papers if all the variables, also the secondaries, go well in the final scenario.
That's great. Thanks very much, Salvador. You definitely get the gold medal for your second lecture in English. You did a really fantastic job. I'd just like to wrap this up just by saying just a few last things here. That ultimately what's really interesting as part of this conversation is, although we started with territorial transformations, if anything, connecting a few dots here between a kind of focus on matter and mapping as a strategy, and then also models of practice regarding potentially territories of practice. If anything, the conversations here lead towards potentially like a deterritorialization of practice itself, and also injecting designation as part of the work of design, right? When we specify materials, that decision, that designation of that material affects these territories. And in an instant, if anything, maybe there's no time scale, it's immediate. And what I think is particularly interesting here is that the structural change is maybe we need to spend maybe just as much time or maybe even, I'll be careful here, less time on design and just bring the management of the projects in, right? Because we essentially relegate that specification to the project management level. And so if anything, it's invigorating and exciting to understand how one could potentially even suspend notions of territories of influence and really start to deterritorialize it through, as Matt said, undesign. Thank you very much to the panel. Salvador.
Thanks, everyone. And I think this is a great way to also connect to our opening remarks about urban metabolism as a way to, question how we position ourselves toward multiple contexts. So we can have a shorter break than we planned and try to be back in like 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, like 10 past 4. Thank you.